What if everything you thought you knew about the world was wrong? What if the very ground beneath your feet wasn't moving, and your health depended on balancing strange liquids inside you? Get ready to step into a world from roughly 500 to 1500 AD, where some truly wild ideas were considered undeniable truth. Number 1. The wandering womb caused women's illnesses. Picture this. You are a woman in the medieval period, and you are feeling unwell. Perhaps you are experiencing mood swings, anxiety, or even physical discomfort. What could possibly be the cause? According to the prevailing medical wisdom of the era, the answer might just be that your uterus has decided to take a stroll inside your body. Yes, you read that correctly. For centuries, a theory known as the wandering womb, or suffocation of the womb, was accepted as a legitimate medical explanation for a vast array of female ailments. This idea, largely rooted in the writings of ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and later adopted and elaborated upon by medieval scholars, posited that the uterus was an organ capable of independent movement. The theory suggested that the uterus, depicted almost as an animalistic entity within the female body, would become restless and dissatisfied if it was not regularly moistened or satisfied through sexual activity and procreation. If it was left dry or unused, it would then detach itself from its proper place and wander upwards through the abdomen and even into the chest or head. The specific symptoms a woman experienced were thought to depend on where the uterus decided to travel and what organs it pressed against or suffocated along the way. If it moved towards the heart, it could cause palpitations and fainting. If it ascended to the throat, it might lead to a sensation of choking or difficulty breathing, a condition often called suffocation of the mother or hysteria. Headaches, dizziness, anxiety, melancholy, and even paralysis were all attributed to this rogue organ's adventurous journeys. This concept was not just a fringe idea. It was a cornerstone of medieval gynecological understanding, such as it was. Medical texts and university lectures taught physicians about the wandering womb. For example, the influential Roman physician Galen, whose works dominated medieval medicine, did not fully endorse the uterus's ability to roam freely like an animal, but he did acknowledge that it could shift from its normal position and cause various symptoms. His interpretations, often simplified and sometimes distorted over centuries of translation and reinterpretation, still contributed to the persistence of the wandering womb theory. Medieval physicians, armed with Galen's teachings and often little else in terms of anatomical understanding, found this theory a convenient and seemingly logical explanation for the complex and often baffling symptoms presented by their female patients. Treatments prescribed for a wandering womb were as imaginative as the diagnosis itself. Since the uterus was thought to be seeking moisture and scent, physicians would attempt to lure it back into its proper place by applying strong-smelling substances. Foul-smelling ingredients, like bird feathers, rotten eggs, or even animal excrement, would be placed near the woman's nose with the aim of repelling the uterus downwards. Conversely, sweet-smelling substances, such as pleasant herbs, oils, or fumigations, would be applied to the vaginal area, hoping to entice the uterus to return to its original position. In some cases, more drastic measures were proposed, including massage, hot baths, or even vigorous physical activity, all aimed at coaxing the uterus back to where it supposedly belonged. Marriage and childbearing were often presented as the ultimate cure, as these were believed to keep the womb properly occupied and therefore content in its place. This made sense within the framework of the theory. A satisfied womb would stay put. The wandering womb theory deeply impacted how women's health was perceived and treated. It pathologized natural female experiences, attributing a wide range of emotional and physical discomforts to an organ acting out. It also reinforced societal expectations for women, linking their well-being directly to their reproductive function and marital status. If a woman was unmarried or had not borne children, her perceived illnesses could be easily attributed to her unsatisfied uterus, placing the blame in a way on her lifestyle rather than any actual medical condition. This theory highlights the limited understanding of human anatomy and physiology during the medieval period, where theoretical constructs based on ancient authority often superseded direct observation or empirical evidence. The world of medieval medicine was one where observation was often filtered through a lens of existing beliefs, and the wandering womb was a powerful example of how a compelling, if bizarre, idea could shape centuries of medical practice and societal views on women's bodies. It was a theory that provided a comprehensive, if completely incorrect, explanation for a myriad of female sufferings, leaving a lasting mark on the history of medicine and gender. Number 2. Your future was written in the stars by astrology. Imagine a world where your daily decisions, your health, your love, life, and even your ultimate fate were all dictated by the precise positions of celestial bodies. For people living in the medieval period, astrology was not some mystical parlor trick or a quirky newspaper column. It was a serious, complex, and incredibly influential science that permeated nearly every aspect of life. From predicting a king's reign to deciding the best time for a medical procedure, the stars held the keys to understanding and navigating the world. This was not merely a superstition. It was a deeply integrated system of knowledge, often taught in universities and consulted by the most learned minds of the era. Astrology in the medieval period was built upon a long tradition stretching back to ancient Babylonian, Greek, and Roman practices, which were then heavily influenced by Islamic scholars who preserved and expanded upon these ideas. It was understood as a comprehensive system where the movements and relationships of the sun, moon, planets, and fixed stars exerted direct and powerful influences on terrestrial events and human lives. The cosmos was seen as an interconnected entity, a grand machine, where every part affected every other part. A person's birth chart, a map of the heavens at the exact moment of their birth, was believed to be a blueprint for their character, their destiny, and their susceptibility to certain illnesses. These charts were meticulously calculated, often by professional astrologers who possessed advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge for their time. The reach of astrology was astonishingly broad. Physicians, for example, were often trained in astrology and would consult astrological charts before making critical medical decisions. They believed that specific planets and zodiac signs governed different parts of the body and various diseases. Bloodletting, a common medieval medical practice, was performed only when the moon was in a favorable sign, so as not to cause more harm than good. A medical text from the period might advise against bleeding a patient when the moon was in Taurus, as Taurus was believed to govern the neck and throat, making the procedure dangerous in that region. Even the timing for administering herbal remedies or performing surgery was often determined by astrological alignments. It was thought that if a planet was afflicted or in a bad house, any medical intervention undertaken at that time would likely fail or worsen the patient's condition. Beyond medicine, astrology influenced agriculture, warfare, and even daily commerce. Farmers would consult astrological calendars to determine the best time to plant crops, believing that the lunar phases or planetary positions could impact yields. Commanders might consult astrologers to choose auspicious dates for battles, hoping to gain a cosmic advantage over their enemies. Merchants might pick specific times to begin journeys or make major trades. Building a new castle or starting a significant project often involved astrological consultation to ensure long-term success. The belief was that by aligning human actions with the cosmic rhythms, one could harness the universe's power and increase the likelihood of a positive outcome. Despite the Church's complex relationship with astrology, sometimes condemning it as divination, other times tolerating or even using it, it remained deeply entrenched. Some theologians argued that while the stars might incline, They did not compel human free will. However, this nuance was often lost in practice, as many people treated astrological predictions as immutable facts. The scientific basis for astrology rested on observation. The predictable movements of celestial bodies seemed to correlate with seasons, tides, and agricultural cycles. It was a small, seemingly logical leap to believe that these powerful distant lights also affected human bodies and events. The sophisticated mathematical models developed by astronomers, such as the tables for planetary motion, were primarily created for astrological purposes. These models, though complex and often inaccurate by modern standards, demonstrated a serious intellectual effort to understand and predict the heavens, all in service of understanding earthly life. It was a world where the macrocosm, the universe, was thought to directly mirror and influence the microcosm, humanity and Earth, creating a powerful framework for understanding existence. The stars were not just distant lights. They were an active, influential force, writing out the blueprint of every life on Earth. Number 3. Lead could turn into gold through alchemy. Imagine a world where the boundaries between science, magic, and philosophy were blurred into a single, ambitious pursuit. This was the world of alchemy, not just a desperate quest for riches, but a profound attempt to understand the fundamental nature of matter, to perfect it, and even to achieve immortality. And at the heart of this intricate system was the deeply held belief that common base metals like lead could absolutely, without a doubt, be transformed into pure, gleaming gold. This wasn't a whimsical dream. It was a serious theoretical pursuit, often backed by intricate philosophical arguments and painstaking, if alternately fruitless, experimentation. Alchemy in the medieval period drew heavily from ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the ideas of Aristotle, who taught that all matter was composed of 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These elements were thought to possess fundamental qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Crucially, medieval alchemists believed that different substances were simply different combinations and proportions of these elements and their qualities. If you could somehow alter these proportions or introduce a perfecting agent, you could change one substance into another. Gold, being incorruptible and lustrous, was considered the most perfect metal, while lead was one of the most imperfect or sick metals. The goal was to cure lead, to elevate it to gold's perfect state. Core of the alchemical quest was the search for the philosopher's stone. This legendary substance was not just a stone. It was believed to be a catalyst, a potent elixir that could transmute base metals into gold, cure all diseases, and even grant eternal life. Descriptions of the philosopher's stone varied wildly, from a red powder to a gleaming liquid, but its power was universally revered. Alchemists spent their entire lives in often dangerous laboratories, heating, cooling, distilling, and dissolving various substances in intricate glassware, all in the hope of discovering or creating this elusive stone. They worked with mercury, sulfur, salts, and various organic compounds, observing color changes, precipitates, and strange fumes, convinced that these were signs of matter undergoing fundamental transformation. Notable figures throughout the medieval Islamic world, and then in Europe, contributed to and perpetuated alchemical theories. Jabir ibn Hayyan, an influential Islamic alchemist from the 8th century, developed many of the theoretical frameworks and practical techniques that were later adopted in Europe. He proposed a sulfur-mercury theory, suggesting that all metals were formed from varying proportions of sulfur, representing combustibility, and mercury, representing metallic properties. By manipulating these 2 principles, one could change metals. Later European alchemists, like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon, respected scholars and natural philosophers, wrote extensively on alchemical theories, demonstrating its intellectual legitimacy. They saw alchemy not just as a means to create gold, but as a path to understanding the deeper spiritual laws of the universe. The transformation of base metal to gold was often seen as a metaphor for spiritual purification and perfection of the human soul. The facts that supported alchemy were often based on apparent observations and philosophical reasoning. When certain metals were heated or mixed, they would change color, melt, solidify, or form new substances that looked different from the original components. To the alchemist, these changes were not merely chemical reactions, but evidence of a substance shedding its imperfect form and striving towards perfection. If lead could be turned into a purer form through various processes, why could it not be turned into the purest form? Gold. The secrecy surrounding alchemical practices, often communicated in obscure allegories and symbols, also contributed to its mystique and perpetuated the belief in its hidden truths. Alchemists guarded their processes, believing that true knowledge should only be revealed to the worthy, which further obscured their failures and made it harder for anyone to definitively disprove their claims. This pursuit was a defining feature of the medieval intellectual landscape, a profound blend of early chemistry, philosophy, and spiritual seeking, all centered on the extraordinary idea that the elements themselves could be perfected, with gold being the ultimate symbol of that perfection. Number 4. Illnesses were caused by an imbalance of 4 humors. Step back into the medieval medical world and prepare to have your understanding of health and disease completely rewired. Forget about germs, viruses, or genetic predispositions. For centuries, across Europe and the Islamic world, the prevailing medical theory was that your well-being, your personality, and every illness you experienced were all dictated by the delicate balance of 4 fundamental bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This was the theory of humorism, a sophisticated and comprehensive system that explained everything from a common cold to a fit of rage, and it was taught as irrefutable fact in every medical university. The roots of humorism stretch back to ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates, but it was largely formalized and expanded upon by the Roman physician Galen in the 2nd century AD. Galen's voluminous writings became the undisputed authority in medicine for over 1,000 years, revered by medieval scholars who often considered his word as good as gospel. According to this theory, each humor was associated with specific qualities, elements, and seasons. Blood, associated with heat and wetness, linked to the element air and spring. It was believed to be produced in the liver and related to a sanguine temperament, optimistic, courageous. Phlegm, associated with coldness and wetness, linked to the element water and winter. It was believed to be produced in the brain and lungs, relating to a phlegmatic temperament, calm, rational, but potentially sluggish. Yellow bile, or choler, associated with heat and dryness, linked to the element fire and summer. It was believed to be produced in the gallbladder, relating to a choleric temperament, ambitious, easily angered. Black bile, or melancholy, associated with coldness and dryness, linked to the element earth and autumn. It was believed to be produced in the spleen and stomach, relating to a melancholic temperament, introspective, thoughtful, prone to sadness. Health was defined as a perfect equilibrium of these 4 humors. If one humor became too dominant or too deficient, illness would arise. For example, a fever might be attributed to an excess of hot blood or yellow bile. Common cold, with its runny nose and congestion, was seen as an excess of cold, wet phlegm. Depression, known as melancholy, was believed to be caused by an overabundance of black bile. The logic was clear. If you could identify the humor out of balance, you could restore equilibrium and thus restore health. Diagnosis often involved meticulous examination of a patient's symptoms, but also their temperament, their diet, and even their urine and stool, which were thought to reflect the state of the humors. A physician might look at the color and consistency of urine for clues, or feel a patient's pulse, which was believed to indicate the strength and quality of their humors. Once a diagnosis was made, treatment focused on rebalancing the humors. The most common and drastic treatment was bloodletting, performed by cutting a vein or applying leeches to remove excess blood. Purging, inducing vomiting, or laxatives were used to expel unwanted humors through the digestive system. Specific diets, herbal remedies, and even changes in lifestyle were prescribed to either increase or decrease certain humors. For instance, a person with an excess of hot yellow bile might be advised to eat cooling foods and avoid spicy ones. The humor theory provided a complete and seemingly rational framework for understanding the human body and disease in a time before germ theory or advanced anatomical knowledge. It offered a consistent explanation for why people got sick, why they had different personalities, and how they could be cured. It intertwined bang with broader philosophical ideas about the elements and the cosmos, making it seem even more foundational and true. Every physician, every medical student, and even common folk understood their bodies through this lens. This meant that a headache was not just a headache. It was a sign of a deeper humoral imbalance requiring specific intervention to prevent further illness. The world was a complex interplay of qualities, and the human body was no exception. A delicate vessel whose contents needed constant care and balance to maintain health. Number 5. Unicorns existed and their horns held. Magical cures. Prepare to have your perception of medieval natural history radically altered. While today we relegate unicorns to the realm of fantasy, for people in the medieval period, these majestic, single-horned beasts were very much considered real living creatures. More than that, their horns, often referred to as alicorns, were believed to possess extraordinary magical powers, especially the ability to detect and neutralize poisons, making them one of the most coveted and expensive commodities in the known world. This was not a fairy tale for children. It was a deeply held conviction, documented in respected texts and pursued by kings and queens. The belief in unicorns stems from ancient Greek and Roman accounts, but it truly flourished in the medieval Christian imagination. Descriptions of the unicorn, often found in medieval bestiaries, illustrated compilations of animals, both real and mythical, accompanied by moral or allegorical interpretations, painted a vivid picture. It was usually depicted as a horse-like creature, sometimes with a goat's beard and cloven hooves, but always, unequivocally, with a single, long, spiraling horn protruding from its forehead. Bestiaries, like the popular physiologists, described the unicorn as a fierce, wild, and incredibly powerful beast that could only be tamed by a virgin maiden. This allegorical aspect connected the unicorn to Christ and the Virgin Mary, further cementing its place in the medieval worldview as a creature of immense spiritual significance. The most sought-after quality of the unicorn was its horn. It was widely believed that the alicorn had the power to purify contaminated water, make poison drinks safe, and even cure various diseases. If a unicorn dipped its horn into a polluted stream, the water would immediately become potable. If a cup made of alicorn was used to hold a poisoned drink, the poison would either be rendered harmless or would visibly react, perhaps by frothing or changing color, alerting the drinker to the danger. This made alicorns incredibly valuable, especially for royalty and wealthy nobles who constantly feared assassination by poisoning. Kings would pay exorbitant sums for what they believed to be authentic unicorn horns, using them as drinking vessels or having them ground into powder, to be taken as a preventative measure against illness and poison. The facts that supported this belief came from several sources. Actual narwhal tusks, often several feet long and spiraled, were frequently passed off as genuine unicorn horns by unscrupulous merchants. These tusks, found in the Arctic, were exotic and rare enough to fuel the myth. When a narwhal tusk was presented, Its unusual appearance seemed to confirm the existence of such a creature. Furthermore, anecdotal evidence, where a person drank from a supposed alicorn cup and did not die of poison, would reinforce the belief. The absence of death was attributed to the horn's power, rather than the absence of poison in the first place. The deep religious symbolism attached to the unicorn also lent it credibility. If God created all creatures, and if the unicorn was mentioned in biblical interpretations as a symbol of purity and strength, then it must exist. The obsession with unicorn horns demonstrates the medieval reliance on tradition, allegory, and belief in the natural world's mystical properties. It was a time when the boundaries between natural history and symbolic meaning were fluid. The unicorn was not just an animal. It was a living symbol, and its horn was a miraculous tool believed to offer protection and healing in a world where disease and sudden death were ever-present threats. The desire for a cure-all, a magical protection against hidden dangers, made the unicorn horn an irresistible item, driving a trade in what were in reality narwhal tusks, but believed to be proof of a fantastic creature that held extraordinary power. Number 6. The Earth stood still at the center of the universe, geocentrism. For over 1,400 years, the overwhelming consensus across Europe and the Middle East was that the Earth was the undisputed, immovable center of the universe. The sun, moon, planets, and all the stars revolved around it in perfectly circular paths. This was not merely a philosophical notion. It was the dominant cosmological model, backed by sophisticated mathematical calculations, observational evidence, as they understood it, and deep theological implications. This was the Ptolemaic geocentric model, and it was taught as an absolute, unshakable truth. This idea, known as geocentrism, had ancient roots stretching back to Greek philosophers like Aristotle. He argued that the Earth was stationary because there was no perceived motion. If the Earth were moving, he reasoned, objects dropped would not fall straight down, and winds would constantly be blowing from one direction. The stars, appearing to spin around us every night, also logically implied that we were at the center. However, it was Claudius Ptolemy, a Roman-Egyptian astronomer and mathematician from the 2nd century AD, who developed the most comprehensive and enduring geocentric model. His monumental work, the Almagest, codified the system, describing a universe where Earth was at the core, encircled by nested, transparent spheres. On each sphere, a celestial body was affixed: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, followed by the sphere of fixed stars. Ptolemy's model was incredibly ingenious because it accounted for the complex, seemingly erratic movements of the planets. Planets, when observed from Earth, sometimes appear to stop, move backward for a time, retrograde motion, and then resume their forward path. To explain this without having the planets orbit anything but Earth, Ptolemy introduced epicycles and a deferens. Planet did not just orbit Earth on its main deferent circle. It also simultaneously moved on a smaller circle called an epicycle, whose center moved along the deferent. This combination of circles created the illusion of retrograde motion from Earth's perspective. He also used equants, a mathematical point off the center of the deferent, to account for variations in planetary speeds. This complex geometric model was highly sophisticated, and crucially, it made accurate predictions for planetary positions, which was essential for navigation, timekeeping, and especially for astrology. The geocentric model resonated deeply with medieval Christian theology. If humanity was God's greatest creation, then it made perfect sense that their home, Earth, would be at the very center of the cosmos. The universe was seen as a perfectly ordered hierarchical structure, with Earth at the bottom, and the celestial spheres moving outwards, closer to God's heavenly realm. The outermost sphere, the primo mobile, or prime mover, was believed to be set in motion by God, and its movement propelled all the inner spheres. This reinforced the idea of a divinely ordered and purposeful universe, with humanity at its spiritual and physical heart. The model was taught in universities and illustrated in countless diagrams, serving as the foundational understanding of the universe for scholars and ordinary people alike. The facts supporting geocentrism were numerous, at least from a medieval perspective. The most obvious was direct observation. The sun clearly rose in the east and set in the west every day, as did the stars. It simply looked like everything revolved around Earth. There was no sensation of Earth moving, no strong winds generated by a constantly spinning planet, and no observable parallax in the stars. The apparent shift in position of nearby stars against more distant ones, as Earth orbits the sun, medieval instruments weren't precise enough to detect. These seemingly undeniable observations, combined with the authority of ancient Greek philosophers and the theological comfort of humanity's central place, made the geocentric model an absolute, unshakable truth for centuries. It was the only way they could conceive of a universe that made sense and felt right. Number 7. Life could spontaneously generate from non-living matter. Imagine a time when the mere sight of maggots squirming on decaying meat or mice appearing in a pile of old rags was not a sign of flies laying eggs or rodents seeking shelter, but rather definitive proof that life could simply spring into existence from non-living matter. For centuries, this theory, known as spontaneous generation, was widely accepted as a fundamental principle of biology, or what passed for it in the medieval period. It was a seemingly logical explanation for the appearance of life forms where none had been observed before, and it accounted for the sudden emergence of creatures like worms, insects, and even certain small animals. The idea of spontaneous generation has ancient roots notably articulated by Aristotle, whose theories on biology profoundly influenced medieval thought. Aristotle observed that insects seemed to appear from morning dew, or that worms emerged from rotting flesh. He concluded that certain kinds of living organisms could arise directly from inorganic matter or from organic matter in the process of decay, provided the right conditions were present, such as heat, moisture, and vital heat, a mysterious life-giving force. For example, he proposed that eels could spontaneously generate from mud, or that flies arose from putrefying dung. This concept fit neatly into a worldview that saw nature as constantly creating and transforming, and it provided a ready explanation for the appearance of seemingly random life. In the medieval period, these ancient ideas were integrated into the prevailing understanding of the natural world. Scholars and common folk alike observed phenomena that seemed to support spontaneous generation. It was a common fact that maggots spontaneously arose from rotting meat. They didn't see the tiny eggs laid by flies. They just saw the worms appear. Frogs and toads were thought to emerge from the mud during spring rains. Certain insects were believed to spontaneously generate from dew or from the bodies of dead animals. The presence of fleas was just an unfortunate natural outcome, not necessarily a sign of specific reproduction. This theory was not just limited to small, lower forms of life. It was also used to explain the sudden appearance of vermin like mice in stored grain or dusty corners. The idea was that the vital force present in the decaying matter, combined with environmental conditions like warmth and moisture, was enough to spark life. The evidence for spontaneous generation was purely observational and lacked experimental rigor. People simply saw an outcome, life appearing, and deduced a cause, spontaneous creation. There was no understanding of microorganisms or the life cycles of many insects and parasites. Microscopes, which would later reveal the unseen world of bacteria and insect eggs, would not be invented until the late 17th century, long after the medieval period had ended. Without such tools, the idea of tiny, invisible seeds of life was simply not part of their conceptual framework. The most straightforward explanation for the sudden appearance of life in a given environment was that it had spontaneously arisen from the non-living material present. This belief had practical implications too. It meant that cleanliness was not necessarily connected to preventing certain infestations, as the creatures would simply appear when conditions were right. It shaped their understanding of disease, as some illnesses were thought to arise from the spontaneous generation of corrupted humors within the body. The acceptance of spontaneous generation highlights the medieval period's reliance on direct, unassisted observation and logical deduction based on limited information rather than controlled experimente. It was a world where common sense, guided by ancient authorities, provided compelling, if ultimately incorrect, explanations for the mysteries of life. Number 8. Bleeding people cured almost any illness. If you fell ill in the medieval period, whether with a fever, a headache, a cough, or even a mental ailment, there was an extremely high chance that one of the first and most common treatments you would receive was bloodletting. This practice, involving the intentional removal of blood from a patient's body, was not a last resort. It was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, taught in every medical school and performed by physicians, barbers, and even lay practitioners. The belief was that bleeding the patient would restore the balance of the body's humors, remove harmful substances, and ultimately cure the illness. Bloodletting was deeply rooted in the theory of humorism, which, as mentioned earlier, posited that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance, often an excess of one or more humors, particularly blood. If a patient had a fever, it was believed that they had too much hot blood. They were agitated, it might be due to an excess of yellow bile, which could be reduced by removing blood. The logic was simple. Remove the excess, and the body would return to equilibrium. The specific amount of blood to be removed, and from which part of the body, was carefully chosen, based on the patient's age, constitution, and the nature of their illness, often guided by astrological considerations. There were several methods of bloodletting. The most common was venesection, which involved making an incision into a vein, usually in the arm, cubital vein, but sometimes in the leg or neck. Patients would often be positioned so that the blood would flow into a bowl, and the practitioner would estimate the quantity removed by eye, or by counting the number of bowls filled. Another common method was scarification, where small cuts were made on the skin, and then a heated cup, cupping glass, was applied over them. As the cup cooled, it created a vacuum, drawing blood to the surface. Leeches were also frequently used, particularly for localized swelling or inflammation, as the leeches would suck blood from a specific area. The facts that supported bloodletting were based on what appeared to be observable improvements in some patients. After bleeding, a feverish patient might feel cooler, due to blood loss and a temporary drop in blood pressure, or feel generally weaker, which was interpreted as the body being rid of the bad humors. The temporary relief of symptoms or the patient's eventual recovery, which might have happened anyway, was attributed to the bloodletting. Furthermore, there was a deeply ingrained physiological understanding that blood was a powerful, dynamic fluid, and that its manipulation could profoundly impact the body. The very act of seeing bad blood leave the body provided a tangible visual confirmation of the treatment's effectiveness, reinforcing the belief for both patient and practitioner. Bloodletting was practiced on nearly everyone, from infants to the elderly, and for almost every ailment, from headaches to pneumonia, from mental illness to plague. It was not just a medical procedure, it was a cultural norm, a regular practice for maintaining health, even when not sick. Some people underwent preventative bloodletting seasonally, believing it would keep their humors balanced and ward off disease. Despite the obvious risks of infection, excessive blood loss, and weakening already sick patients, The practice endured for centuries, driven by the weight of ancient authority, especially Galen, the lack of alternative effective treatments, and the compelling logic of the humoral theory. It was a profound illustration of how a theoretical framework could dictate medical intervention, often with severe and unintended consequences, all in the earnest belief of restoring health. Number 9. The geocentric universe was surrounded by crystalline spheres. In the medieval understanding of the cosmos, the universe was not an endless, empty void filled with scattered stars. Instead, it was an incredibly ordered and hierarchical structure, with Earth at its very center, encased within a series of perfectly smooth, transparent, and unimaginably vast crystalline spheres. These spheres, invisible but real, were believed to carry the sun, moon, planets, and fixed stars in their majestic, eternal revolutions around our stationary home. This was a core component of the Ptolemaic geocentric model, a concept taught as an absolute truth and reinforced by both ancient philosophy and theological doctrine. The idea of celestial spheres originated with ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who sought to explain the observed movements of celestial bodies with perfect, unchangeable forms. Aristotle envisioned a series of concentric, interconnected spheres made of a perfect, uncorruptible fifth element, the aether. Each sphere moved independently, but influenced the one below it. Ptolemy later developed the mathematical models for how these spheres and their embedded bodies moved, using his system of epicycles and deferents to explain the complex planetary paths. Medieval scholars meticulously adopted and elaborated upon this framework. The universe was seen as a giant, intricate clockwork mechanism with the Earth firmly anchored in the middle. There were typically 8 or 9 spheres, though some models proposed more. The innermost sphere carried the Moon, the next Mercury, then Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Beyond Saturn was the sphere of the fixed stars, which appeared motionless relative to each other, simply rotating as a single unit around the Earth. The final sphere, often called the primomobile, the first mover, was believed to be the outermost sphere, imparted with motion by God Himself, and it transmitted this motion down through all the inner spheres, causing them to turn. Some models even included an additional sphere, the Empyrean heaven, beyond the primomobile, as the dwelling place of God and the blessed. These spheres were not empty space. They were thought to be solid, tangible, albeit transparent entities, like giant nested glass or crystal globes. The facts that supported the idea of crystalline spheres were primarily observational and philosophical. The apparent perfect, unchanging, and circular motion of the celestial bodies, especially the stars, seemed to necessitate a solid, unyielding medium to carry them. How else could they maintain such perfect paths? If they were simply floating in empty space, it was reasoned, their movements would be chaotic or less precise. The concept of aether as a perfect, incorruptible substance distinct from the corruptible elements of Earth further supported the idea of these perfect, transparent spheres. Furthermore, the model provided a tidy, comprehensible structure for the universe, one that resonated deeply with medieval theological beliefs about order, hierarchy, and God's divine plan. The regular, predictable movement of the heavens was seen as evidence of divine design and the perfection of creation. Crystalline spheres, while invisible to the naked eye, were considered physically real. They were believed to generate the music of the spheres, a harmonious sound undetectable by human ears, but believed to be present due to the friction of these massive spheres rubbing against each other as they spun. This cosmic harmony was another philosophical argument for their existence. The universe was a grand, perfect, and ordered cosmos with every part having its place and purpose, all held together by these invisible, perfectly sculpted crystalline shells carrying the celestial bodies in their eternal dance around humanity's central abode. This was the structure of their reality, the map of their universe, and a profound testament to the order and perfection they believed existed in God's creation.